Good evening. Okay, I'm going to hold that a little further away from my mouth. Good evening. I'm Reverend Jonathan Elsenson. I'm the minister of the First Baptist Church in Freehold Borough, and I welcome you all to the first in this series of our Children of God discussions. Moving down the line, next to me is my wife, Jen Elsenson. She's the pastoral associate here at St. Robert Bellarmine, the Co-Cathedral of St. Robert Bellarmine. This empty chair will be filled, I promise, with Fatima Jaffrey, who is the religious educator at Beit Wali Asr Islamic Center, just a little bit down Georgia Road. She'll be here momentarily. She was headed to a different house of worship. Down from where Fatima will be is Rabbi Melinda Pankin. She's the rabbi at Temple Sheri Emeth, and down at the end is Monsignor Sam Siriani, the pastor here at the Co-Cathedral of St. Robert Bellarmine. Tonight, our session is entitled, Because I Was Not, Standing Up to Hate and Fear in Our Communities. Our session this evening draws its title from a poem by a German Lutheran pastor named Martin Niemöller. I'm pretty sure most of you have heard this poem that I'll read shortly. Niemöller was active during World War II, and as a German Lutheran, he found himself as an opponent of Hitler and the Nazi Party and the widespread anti-Semitism of that era. And for standing up to the powers that be at that time, he was incarcerated at Sachsenhausen and Dachau concentration camps. And later on, after the war, he became famous for the Stuttgart Declaration of Guilt, which was the predominantly Protestant German churches admitting that they had aided the rise of this terrible regime that resulted in the deaths of over 11 million people. He also went on to oppose the war in Vietnam, going as far as to meet with Ho Chi Minh to see if there was a peaceful resolution to the conflict following the French occupation of the country. And he was also a vocal critic of nuclear proliferation. His time during the war really changed his view of his neighbors. So the poem that you're probably familiar with, from which our session draws its title, goes like this. First, they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. This poem was a distillation of his thought, of his reckoning with his own actions that led to his decisions during the time of World War II. And these decisions came at a personal cost. He was incarcerated in 2 concentration camps. But what is surprising about his story is that he was originally a supporter of Hitler and the Nazi Party. He was noted in that time of his life as an anti-Semite. He harbored Christianized Jews, but he spoke poorly about them, wondering aloud in his sermons and in his public words why Jews deserved the punishment that seemed to follow them through the ages. But his time in the concentration camps changed his view of the things that he held so certain. His experiences drove him deeper into the questions of his beliefs, which demonstrated how closed he could be to the needs and concerns of others. And that process led him to embrace wide-ranging concerns. I think this is an important point for us to consider, specifically at this moment in American history. For the past 50 or so years, we've seen the building of a reactionary movement, which is known as Christian nationalism. And because this is a confusing topic, I think it's an important thing to define our terms. Nationalism is distinguished from patriotism. Patriotism is pride in our country, but nationalism is the unquestioned supremacy of one's own country. Your country stands above all others. One of the hallmarks of nationalism is that it cannot abide critique. In Niemöller's time, the Nazi Party was known by its full name, the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Their hymn, Deutschland über alles, Germany over all, a nationalist movement. In our time, Christian nationalism is a fusing of religious and state identities. In order to be a good Christian, you must be a good American. In order to be a good American, you must be a good Christian. And like all nationalist movements, there is necessarily a very small group who qualifies as the good or the in group. In Niemöller's time, it was the Aryans, not the Jews or the Slavs or the Poles or the Roma. And while we have not seen such an overt declaration from Christian nationalists in our country, by and large the definition has moved to embrace white evangelical Protestants. And I'll get into that a little bit more in a bit. But first I want to acknowledge my own experience here. I approach this from a unique perspective. I'm an American Baptist, and one of the things that sets us apart from our cousins, the Southern Baptists, or any of the other branches of the Baptist family tree, is we hold true to our founding belief in religious liberty for all. It's not an accident that the state of Rhode Island was founded by who is considered to be the first American Baptist, Roger Williams. In Providence, Rhode Island, you'll find the First Baptist Church of the Americas. But you'll also find the oldest continually operating synagogue in the United States, Touro Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island, founded in approximately 1658. Even in a time when non-pilgrims and non-Puritans were not welcome in some of the other colonies, when the Quakers had to found their own colony to be safe, when Catholics had to found Maryland in order to be safe and practice their own faiths, Rhode Island, founded by the American Baptists, embraced all religious traditions. It's hard to get along sometimes. It's hard to get along with members of our own faith traditions. You won't find much common cause between American Baptists and Southern Baptists. Sometimes you have to strain to find common cause between American Baptists and Catholics, between Christians and Jews and Muslims. And that is why we hold these discussions, to expand the grounds of understanding one another and finding our commonality in order to work with and for one another. There's a movie out now called The Banshees of Inisherin. Has anyone seen it? Yes, I know you saw it. It's a movie set in Western Ireland on the Aran Islands off of the coast, and it's about two friends, lifelong friends, who fall out with one another. It's set in the late 1920s, towards the conclusion of the period known as the Irish Civil War, when what we now know as the Republic of Ireland was established, and what we now know as Northern Ireland was set up as a Protestant state. These two friends come into conflict with one another despite having spent their lives with one another. One of them decides he simply doesn't want anything to do with the other one day, and he leaves his friend Porrig to wonder why. There's a background scene in the film. Gunshots are heard on the mainland, but not on the island where this all takes place. And people mention that there's set to be executions, and they can't quite determine whether it's the Free State soldiers executing the IRA soldiers, or the IRA soldiers executing the Free State soldiers. Their friendship and their strain on it is a metaphor for this conflict. The Free State and the IRA found common cause in moving the British out of their occupation of Ireland. At that time, there was friendship. There was common cause. But when the Free State was established, the IRA wanted to go farther, to claim Northern Ireland for the Irish, to drive out the English once and for all. And the Republicans in the Free State wanted a period of peace. When their ideas diverged, they turned on one another. And that is why the concept of nationalism, particularly in regards to Christianity, can be such an anathema, such a problem for us, because it encourages people to work together for common cause. But then, when the cause is achieved, the factions brought together begin to turn on one another. Think back to Niemöller's poem. When they came for the communist, he did not speak out because he was not a communist, nor was he a socialist, nor was he a trade unionist, nor was he a Jew. But then when they came for the Protestants, willing participants in the rise of the Nazi Party and the state church, there was no one left to speak for them. One of the most ambitious projects of the Christian nationalist movement was the recent overturn of Roe versus Wade. And I'm not going to speak deeply about the politics behind that, but I want to examine some of the core pieces working there. In the late 1970s and the early 1980s, the moral majority was formed, a cadre of evangelical Protestant churches in the South. And they realized that in order to achieve political power, they needed to find an issue to rally people outside of their communities for support. And they selected the issue of abortion. Now, we're sitting in a Catholic cathedral. The Catholic Church's stance on the sanctity of life from conception to natural death can never be questioned. Countless popes, countless bishops, countless priests have spoken at length. Many of the people in this congregation support the March for Life and all of the other things that go into a defined theology of respect for all life. But they chose this one issue, and they approached it with very different ends. The moral majority sought political power, and others, like the Catholic Church and other concerned religious groups, worked towards the sanctity of life. That common cause has now ended. Roe versus Wade has now been overturned. And if we look at history, when we find these alliances of convenience fail, we find that the parties involved in them turn on one another because the one thing that held them together fractures. In the Banshees of Inisherin, it was the foundation of the Free State. For Niemöller and the Nazis, it was the rise of the church state and the elimination of all people who did not pledge their support to the Nazi Party. There's a core tenet of nationalism and fundamentalism. There's an in-group that deserves benefits and freedoms, and there is opposed to that, an out-group that must be opposed and have limited freedoms. Think back to that text again. The poem outlines that beautifully for us. First, the communists were a threat, then the socialists were a threat, then the trade unions were a threat, and always the Jews were a threat. Nationalist movements require an existential threat, and it's why it's so easy for them to move between whoever that outgroup is. There has been a marked rise in my time here in New Jersey in anti-Semitic and anti-Islamic violence. And the groups behind the perpetration of these acts of violence move so easily between hatred, between Judaism, Islam, LGBTQ members, immigrants, populations. The Aryans had a technical term for all of these people, degenerates. And they meant that in a technical sense. They had degenerated from the ideal of Aryan superiority. They fundamentally did not have a right to exist. We gather in situations like this to reject that understanding of ourselves and our neighbors. Our traditions have so much more in common with one another that do not bind us to alliances of convenience, but teach us to respect and honor and cause to flourish our neighbors and our cousins, brothers and sisters, siblings in faith. I've given you a lot to consider there, and I'll pass it off to my colleagues to give their own interpretations of this fundamental need to share in one another's lives, to build one another's communities. But I'll leave you with this thought. After his complicated life, after his time of service as a U-boat pilot in World War I, his aiding and abetting of the rise of the Nazi Party in the 30s, his internment in the concentration camps, his repentance and his political activism, one of the roles that Martin Niemöller took on was the head of the World Council of Churches. This is a Christian organization that seeks to foster ecumenical relationships between all of the denominations. They are one of the very practical reasons why a child baptized in this cathedral, which practices infant baptism, will be welcomed as a Christian in my Baptist church, which practices believers or adult baptism by full immersion. We decided that we had more in common than we realized, more in common than our individual edicts and doctrines and teachings allowed for. We realized that we were children of the same God, to use the Christian metaphor, sheep of different flocks, but answering to one shepherd. Ecumenical movements, interfaith movements, such as this discussion series, such as the Mosaic Youth Program, seek to bring religious groups together to find that common cause, not an alliance of convenience, but a deep and abiding relationship which helps to avoid the polarization of conflict while still retaining our individual identities. So, I've used up my time. It's my turn to pass this off to, I guess, Rabbi Pankenig. Would you like to go next? Going once? Sure. Sure. Fatima, Monsignor? Okay, you have one right there.
My name is Monsignor Sam Suriani, and I am the rector of the co-cathedral. And I just want to give a little note, because sometimes people ask, what makes a church a cathedral or a co-cathedral? And I just want to direct you to, you see that chair back there? Okay. First of all, a cathedral has the name because it holds the bishop's cathedra, chair. And the chair has always been seen as a symbol of authority. And because we are the bishop's church now, Rome gave its approval, we have his own chair right here that no one can sit in except for the bishop, or if he gives somebody permission, like another bishop. Then again, I think there are snapshots floating around my parish of people sitting in the chair. I wanted to begin with several historical moments. During the Vatican Council, which was for us as Catholics, kind of the renewal and restructuring of how we are church. And we're still in the process, although the council is a good 50, 60 years ago. I remember when I was in the office of worship, someone saying it takes 150 years for the church to implement a council. The first year, just to get us into the same book. The second 50 years to get into the same chapter. And the next 50 years to get us onto the same page. So we now have all the books. We just got to read them now. But one of the documents was the document on the relationship of the church with Judaism. Because if any church has a checkered past with Judaism, it would be the Roman Catholic Church. And a lot of it goes all the way back to the very beginning. And so, due to pogroms, persecutions, the list is very long. I mean, from Isabel and Ferdinand demanding all the Muslims and the Jews in Spain to either convert or leave, to the silence that existed in many different countries in the relationship with the Nazi occupation and the Jews. Now granted, there are many examples of Gentiles, many of them Roman Catholics, many of them priests and bishops and nuns who worked hard to save the Jews during the war, but there was no corporate effort. And I think that is, something that we need to be mindful of. So in Nostatates, my Latin is terrible. Don't tell the bishop, he doesn't know. Trust me, I sit in the deacon's chair when I have to. But the church recognized, first of all, and even before the council, I think it was Pius XII, who was always seen as like the last great traditional pope. Pius XII referred to Catholics as being, Semites, because our roots are in Judaism. And therefore, we need to see the Jewish people as our older brothers and sisters. And that began the move. Now, I say these things, but it's so important to realize not everybody reads the memo, and therefore that we still struggle with those who hold on to prejudice and biases that they were raised with. Another turning point that was very symbolic was in the year 2000, when the Holy Father, St. John Paul II, observed this Jubilee celebration with the healing or the asking for forgiveness. And this was a major celebration in Rome where the church asked forgiveness of Jews, of Protestants, of women, and other groups that we persecuted, that we punished, that we ostracized down through the ages. This was not done easily because there were many groups, especially among the cardinals, who upheld that the church is holy, the church is perfect, the church did not commit sins. The way I get around that is to say, yes, our church is holy, but the sons and daughters aren't. And it's the sons and daughters who get the church into trouble. The teachings of the church are beautiful. How they are interpreted and either enforced or ignored is what trips up the work of the church. And therefore, it is so important that we participate in discussions like this so that we can work through those innate biases that have been part of our tradition for centuries. You can change laws, you can change ordinances, you can change regulations. It's much more difficult to change hearts and to really bring forth conversion, which is one of the main themes of the Vatican Council. It was a call to holiness and a call to conversion. And if you ask any Catholic what conversion is, they'll tell you, well, conversion is when someone who is not Catholic becomes a Catholic. Okay? And it was very prevalent, and I still think it might be prevalent within the Catholic Church. You will meet people who will come up to you and say, oh, Father, I converted 35 years ago. I'm a convert. 35. So when do you become a Catholic? When you're 50 years in the church, then you can say I'm a Catholic? And so these things take time, but they also take education and they take an openness. The struggle of the Catholic Church is also getting our mission, our message out on these new developments. And one of the struggles I have always had as a priest is when the church announced that those who are divorced and remarried were no longer excommunicated. And I just want to give a little background to this one. In the United States, because for the Roman Catholic Church, the United States was an experiment, because nowhere else in Europe did you have a lot of Protestants and Jews and Roman Catholics living in the same community. Nowhere else in Europe did you have a variety of churches of different denominations in the same community. So when Catholics were here, if they got married in the Catholic Church, got a divorce and could not get married in the Catholic Church, well, they could go down to the Methodist Church, they could go to the Baptist Church, they could go to another church. So the bishops, this all goes back to the 1800s. The bishops decided to kind of prevent this. We'll excommunicate them. Well, it didn't work. It worked for many. It worked for many. But it didn't work. And one of the sad parts is what began as if you're divorced and remarried, you get excommunicated, got brought down to if you divorced, you were excommunicated. And I remember meeting men and women who never remarried but felt that they were excommunicated because they got the divorce. So the damage there. And so the church lifted that and said, because that was not a law anyplace else but the United States. In fact, most Catholics and most people don't realize that Catholics can get a divorce, and at one point you had to ask the bishop permission to divorce, and he'd give you permission. So what happened is that this announcement was made in 1972. As a young priest, I was preaching it for the first time in 90, and people didn't hear it. So from 72 to 90, nobody talked about it. Yet, the Friday after Pope Paul VI announced Catholics could have meat on Friday, everybody knew it. So, that's always been my big bugaboo with my faith and my church and the people I love is, if it doesn't affect the stomach, they don't want to hear it. But, so when the church speaks of being open and reestablishing and working with our Jewish brothers and sisters and recognizing our Jewish roots, what happens is some people hear it and it affects them. Many more, it goes right over them. And maybe because they're not Jewish, so it doesn't, matter. And yet, it is so important that we realize that we are all God's children. And the premise of the teachings of the church today, built on the tradition, is that we are all God's children. And we are all created in the image of God. And so therefore, anti-Semitism, especially the violent reaction to Jews, to their property, to Muslims and their property. And you will find on YouTube clips made by priests who will say, well, the Muslims don't believe in the same God we have, and the Jews have done this and the Jews have done that. That all has to be kind of pushed away. In fact, I remember talking to one of our parishioners and I just said, just because they have a collar on doesn't mean they know what they're speaking about, because they're not in line with the church's teachings today. They're quoting what was done in the Middle Ages. But trust me, that priest is not living like a priest in the Middle Ages. They're quoting what might have been done in light of a religious war, or in light of a crusade, or in light of the Reformation, when everybody was angry at everybody. But we're not there anymore. And we need to see how God works. One of the things I try to do in my own preaching is, especially as we get close to Holy Week, because I always tell my people, Holy Week was a rough time for Jews in history, because you'd always get one of these fiery, preachers up there, and everything was bad about the Jews, and and Jesus died on the cross, and he was put on the cross, and everybody would run out to the Jewish neighborhood and burn it down, and feel like they were doing something good. It's important for us to realize that when John writes, the Jew, he's talking about that part of the Jewish community that didn't accept Jesus. Because it's so important for us to realize Jesus died a Jew. Mary was a Jew. St. Joseph was a Jew. All the apostles were Jews. All the early disciples were Jews. If anything, look towards in the scriptures when Jesus is asked by the Syrophoenician woman, a woman of Greek ancestry, that her daughter is ill, and can you cure her? And his response is, I've come for the children of Abraham. I did not come for others. and actually goes so far as to say, you do not give the food to the children, food for the children to the dogs. But this woman, being a woman of strength, says, but the dogs eat the scraps that fall from the table. And Jesus was aware that this woman not only had great faith, but hope. And then he said, go, your daughter will be healed. And she was. Now, I heard one priest say Jesus was testing, but at the last time I didn't see him handing out SATs. I think it's so important that we realize that our Lord Jesus Christ was a man of his time as well as divine, and therefore he would have been there just for the people of Abraham, the children of Abraham. As we become more involved in our communities, and again, another element of Christianity, Catholicism in this country, is we were a religion of the neighborhood. Those of you who are Catholic, who grew up in Brooklyn, in Newark, in Jersey City, you lived in a parish. In fact, even in Brooklyn, people would refer, non-Catholics would refer, they live in St. Agnes Parish, they live in OLA Parish. Okay, because it was that type. When we became accepted into American society and live stream, and that's an important thing that we as Catholics must also remember. I get very angry, especially because I'm of Italian descent, when I hear Italian Catholics speak ill of other ethnic groups because they talked about us as well. They didn't want to hire Italian. They did not want. We smelled, we cooked funny, we spoke with accents. Sound familiar? They've said that about every group that came to this country. And we worked hard to be able to become part of the American dream. The problem is we forgot our roots. And so did the church. The church was persecuted for 300 years by the Roman Empire. Once we got power, we began to persecute. We forget our roots. And so it's so important that we are mindful of what is our core of our faith. I think if anybody has any, Jen.
I'll keep my comments brief. But just to kind of go back to what John led off with about the Catholic Church having a consistent ethic of the sanctity of life, that is also where our need to respect everybody else comes from. We believe in the human dignity of everybody from natural conception to natural death. Everything in between we are expected to protect, and we are, because of that, we need to stand up, or we're taught to stand up for religious freedom, for the sharing of ideas, for the protection of all people, regardless of nation, creed, gender, age, whatever. And the church has loads of commissions on how to protect all of these different individual groups. So that's all I would just add, is that it starts with the fact that everybody is made in the image and likeness of God, but our ethic about the sanctity of human life is something that, as John said before, we are not allowed to argue with. You might have differing opinions on abortion or whatever, but when it comes down to it, the Catholic Church will always say everybody should be protected in every stage of their life, regardless of where they are. Disabled, it does not matter. And even euthanasia, we're against that as well, because we're trying to protect people who are vulnerable.
If I could just add one more thing. On Friday, January 20th, our bishop will be celebrating a Mass for Life, and there will be a luncheon with a presentation next door. The presentation, and at a meeting we had with the diocese, this isn't really kind of like a rally to, be mindful of the abortion question. It is really the beginning of trying to construct a culture of life that respects life in all elements. Because we have to admit, okay, and I know the diehards won't like this, and those who are watching online will probably crucify me, but I'll be hanging out with a good guy. The question of abortion has been settled in the state of New Jersey. It is part of the of law. Now, how do we take care of the families and the women of, who want to do something other than that? And then how do we take care of the children? And how do we take care of the elderly? And how do we take care of those who have no one to take care of them? How do we take care of teenagers? How do we take care of the homeless? This is where our bishops are inviting us. And we're going to get pushback with it because, and I've had this said to me, it dilutes the cause. No, it doesn't dilute the cause. It focuses the cause on the root, and that is the care of the human being. And if we are going to truly be a pro-life church, we need to take care of the whole human being. And so, but, like everything else, if you don't read the memo, you won't know. So, thank you.
First of all, how come our synagogue doesn't? Can I just talk like this? Can you hear me? I feel so big. Oh, online, okay. All right, so then I won't do that. First of all, I just have to say how nice it is after so many years to be back in person together, because this is the first Three Faiths dialogue. It's the first Children of God dialogue that we've actually been in person for 3 years. I am devastated the Elsonsons are leaving, and just want to say I'm so glad we have this time together. Exactly. Just a last time together. We've been doing this for about 10 years, I think, if not more. Is it more? Longer? It was something that, I've always been very invested in interfaith dialogue, and I had originally been the one who pulled this together because I think the only way that we get to the place that Niemöller was is by knowing one another. And we're living in a society right now that is so embroiled in fear, and just the person who disagrees with me must be a monster. They must be a socialist. They must be a fascist, and I can sit here with Monsignor Siriani, and we completely disagree about abortion, and yet I could respect no one more. Because I know who he is in his heart. And that is the world that I hope for. As a Jew, that sense begins with me in the creation of human beings, and in the story of Torah, because for Torah, although Abraham and his family breaks off, the story that begins Abraham and gets us to that point is the story of humanity, that we all come from one family, that we are all the descendants of Adam and Eve. And even if we become different religions or different nationalities, it doesn't matter. That's the thing that connects us. And then we fast forward to the Tower of Babel. Why did God separate everyone and scatter us? Because the Midrash, the Jewish stories, say that when they built the Tower of Babel, they would lose bricks, and they would cry about the bricks, but the bricks would fall on people and kill them, and they would only care about the bricks and not the people. And so rooted in our tradition is this sense that you can't care about the bricks, you have to care about the people. We are all created. That's why we call this the children of God, to remind us that we're all the children of God. We're all created B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God. And then, you think about the oppression of human beings, and for me, one of the models is Abraham. He finds out, God shares with him that God is going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And what does Abraham do? He says, but what if there's 50 innocent people in the town? Are you going to destroy them too? And what about 40? And what about 30? And what about 10? And 10 is where God stops. But Abraham sees that people are going to be destroyed. And what does he do? He stands up against God. So starting with Adam and Eve and moving to Abraham, there's this sense of caring for one another. In the Talmud, it asks, why was the second temple destroyed? And they say because of what's called sinat chinam in Hebrew, which means baseless hatred. That when we hate each other without reason, that is when the temple holiness can't stand in this world. And as a rabbi, I have to tell you, when people are pushing against theology, what's the one thing they ask me? I don't know if you guys get this. Why did God let the Holocaust happen? Right? Like, that's the theological question everyone answers. And my answer to that is always, God didn't let the Holocaust happen. People stopped seeing the image of God in one another. And when we stop doing that, that's when the Holocaust can happen. That's when sinat chinam causes the utter destruction of human beings. Now, we came to decide that we wanted to do this topic tonight because we met right after the synagogue had been told that there was a huge terrorist threat against our community. And, we go through this after the Tree of Life synagogue, the shooting there where Jews at prayer were killed, after San Diego, when more Jews were praying and were killed in their synagogue. We always heighten our security. We for years now have had to invest in making the synagogue a secure place. And then all of a sudden, we had a big event planned for the evening. We were installing our new rabbi who just joined us, who's wonderful, and now there's a terrorist threat. And I can't tell you what it's like to have to feel that going to synagogue is brave. I don't know if you ever feel that, and there have been attacks against churches and mosques for sure. But if you've ever had to walk through your synagogue doors and feel like this was an act of defiance and that this is an act of bravery, that's horrible. And no one should ever have to walk into their holy places feeling that it is a brave act. We should be able to pray in safety and security. And I will tell you that the Jewish community does not feel that safety and security in America right now. The rise of anti-Semitism has been tremendous. The rise of Islamophobia has been tremendous. And it's important for me to share that with you so that you understand what it feels like to look in the back of my sanctuary during services and see an armed guard in Kevlar protecting us. That's the reality, and we're not going to shy away from being at synagogue, and we're going to turn. I said to Monsignor, you shouldn't have to be brave to pray, and he said, we get our courage from prayer. And he's right, it goes both ways. We're not going to stop praying, we're not going to stop going to synagogue. But we do need to be partners in solving this. And so I wanted to focus on what are some of the things that we can actually do that make a difference when these things happen. And what are the things that we do to prevent a world like this from becoming normal? I've been working recently with this group called the One America Movement, which trains clergy in doing dialogues between different sides politically, between Republicans and Democrats. And one of the things that they found was that we believe the other side is more radical than they really are. Okay, so if you ask Democrats if they think that Republicans should teach Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks in school, Democrats will say, only 30% of Republicans would agree with that. But when you ask Republicans, should Rosa Parks and MLK be taught in school, actually 93% think that it should. And it's the same on the other side, the way Republicans view Democrats. So one of the things we need to do, I think, is start checking our assumptions about the other side. And in Judaism, there is a great midrash about a rabbi who's two rabbis walking down the road. It sounds like a joke, I know, but they're walking down the road. There's a dead body that is decaying that they come upon. And one of them says, "Oh, that's disgusting. Ugh." And the other one says, "Look, his teeth are so white." Now, it's a beautiful moment, right? Like, are you seeing the ucky and disgusting, or are you seeing, like, oh, the teeth are so white? Like, can you look at people and see the good in them? And the ability to be able to say, this is my neighbor. They like apple pie too. They like July 4th. You know, they bring soup to their sick neighbors too. And yes, they may disagree with me or vote for things that I think should be part of my freedom, but it doesn't mean that they're demons. It doesn't mean that they're evil. It doesn't mean that they're my enemy. It means we disagree. So I think the first thing is our attitude. The second thing, I think, is getting to know one another. I've been very inspired. In 2018, there was a man named Derek Black who was the son of a grand wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, and his godfather was actually David Duke. You know, you don't get any more white nationalist than that. And he had been homeschooled, so he didn't really have access to a greater world. And he went to college, and all of a sudden, he started meeting different people. And over time, he would continue to spew his nationalist, right-wing, white supremacist views. And after time, he met people who pushed back on it a little bit. And then he met this guy who was Jewish, who said to him, "Why don't you come for Shabbat dinner?" Like, right? This is the response. And the man invited him to Shabbat dinner. They became extremely close friends. Derek Black began to really understand that this person he was afraid of celebrated Shabbat dinner and gave him good challah and lit candles, and it was a beautiful thing. And how did that break down? It broke down because he got to know someone that he was afraid of. He saw what the real picture was. He saw that it wasn't the 30%, it was the 93%, right? He saw who they really were. And that allowed him to step out of the world that he had grown up in. The other thing, another inspirational, and I'm sharing these inspirational moments with you because I think that when hatred shows up in our community, we have to think creatively about how we're doing it. So, do we know someone who really doesn't understand our side of the perspective? Maybe let's invite them to coffee, not if they're dangerous, of course. But, you know, like, could you invite the person who sits on the other side of the aisle from you to go have coffee and just listen and ask questions and approach them with curiosity? And listen with an intent not to change. Monsignor and I will never change each other's opinions about abortion. It's okay. That's okay. In Montana, in Billings, Montana, there was a Jewish family where the son had put his menorah up in the window, piece of artwork, and nationalists threw a brick through the child's bedroom window and broke it. And it upset the town. It had been part of a lot of anti-Semitism that had been brewing. And so people began to make pictures of menorahs and put them in their window. And then the Billings newspaper published a menorah that everybody could put in their window. And although Billings only has 150 Jews, 10,000 residents put up menorahs in their windows. When things in our town happen, can we do something like that? What can we put up in the window to say we stand with you? We have to be louder about saying we stand with you. Otherwise, we feel very lonely in these moments. And the last thing I was going to say is in Toronto, there was some sort of incident. Forgive me because I don't remember, but I was so taken by the response to it. There was an incident against a mosque. And so the community came out during prayer and they made a circle around the mosque so that their friends could go and pray in peace with protection, but also knowing that outside was a supportive community. I share these ideas with you because I think that these things, you know, a few years ago on the Monmouth Heights sign, there were swastikas. It happens here. I remember you called me once saying someone drove through your driveway with Confederate flags. You know, one of the things I try to do during Ramadan, you know, looking for turkeys. I think it was the turkeys that were driving. You know, and I regret that we didn't go out and make a circle around the community, because we should have. So one of the things that I want to say is, if we care, if we really think that Niemöller was right, we can't only just wring our hands and click our tongues and say, this is terrible, or our world. We have to stand up. One of the nicest things you can do when this happens in one of our communities is to call your friends who are Muslim or Jewish or, you know, fill in the blank, African American or immigrant or whatever, and say, are you okay? I'm thinking of you today. That is one of the ways that we keep love in this world. Absolutely.
One thing you said, Rabbi, and it brought back some memories, and I've shared them with some of my priest friends. But I think every one of the priests in the Diocese of Trenton has stood at the altar and looked at the doors and said, what would happen if somebody walked through our doors with a gun? So it is something that we, as clergy, do think about, especially those of us who celebrate the Mass the way the Church asks us to celebrate, and we're looking at the door, you know, because I get the best view. And yet that's a reality. It's a reality very much a part of your life and Fatima's life at this moment.
Can I ask one question about it?
Yes.
When you have that question, are you thinking they're coming in because we're Catholic, or just because people have guns?
They're coming in because they don't like the Catholic Church at this moment. Mm-hmm. I mean, when we look around and see, in light of the Supreme Court decision, all the churches that have been vandalized, burnt, the pregnancy centers that have been bombed and burnt, it is something that has really become something in the front of our minds. And you know, and in light of what has happened to Christian churches, especially in the South, it is very much there. And so, and we've talked about it. We've had the police come through our facilities, but it is a reality. And, you know, you can't say anymore, oh, that won't happen here. Because a lot of things are happening where no one thought it would happen before. Thank you.
The thing I just want to conclude with is coming out to the Children of God dialogue and getting to know. I have some congregants who are not always nice about the Islamic community. And when they start to say, but Muslims are this and Muslims are that, I say to them, come with me, come meet my friend Fatima, and you will see what Muslims are like. You know, you don't know, and do you know Muslims? Are you, you know, like, is this the experience you're having? So one of the ways that we can do this here on the ground is by coming to these events. So next time, everybody bring a friend. Let's expand this dialogue. Let's continue to bring each other together.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the most merciful, the especially merciful. So where do I begin? You guys did such a wonderful job, and it's been such an honor, a great honor to be part of this dialogue series. I think we started in 2009. Yes. We've been doing this for many, many years, and it's always such a beautiful experience to come together, to share, to learn from one another. Sometimes we do repeat topics, and we still learn another layer, and we go deeper into it. So some topics we had in the past, hopefully we'll be able to revisit them. So I'm going to speak a little bit about the principles in Islam as a Muslim. First of all, when I talk about God as a Muslim, because sometimes I might be the first Muslim you've ever met, we're talking about the God of Abraham, okay? And I think because we're here as Abrahamic faiths, we have that in common. And that's the one God, monotheistic faith. And so I call upon God Almighty, the most merciful, the most kind, to help us in this dialogue series and to help with spreading peace and justice throughout the world. So standing up for the people who are oppressed and standing up against injustice is a universal principle. Justice is universal. Does not know any religion, it does not know race, it doesn't know a country or any boundary. Justice is justice. And it's not just about Islam, it's not just about Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, or any other religion. Justice everywhere is justice. And when we go to our holy book, the Quran, when God calls us to be just, it calls us to be fair and to stand side by side with the oppressed. We have a tradition from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his family, to be aware of to be careful and mindful of the prayers of the ones who are oppressed. Because the people who are oppressed, their prayers are accepted by the Almighty. As Muslims, we have responsibilities and we have duties to stand with the oppressed, to show solidarity with them, to support them monetarily, and to give moral support. We can't just turn away and pretend like nothing's going on. And we are actually, as Muslims, when we are turning away from the plight of the oppressed, we're also regarded as the one who is standing with the oppression. There's a narration or a saying from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his family: whoever sees oppression does nothing about it, then he's part of that oppression. We are supposed to be standing out of our comfort zone, and this is something that, for me as a Muslim woman, to come here to speak, to be part of this dialogue series, to be part of the interfaith activities and an integral member of this community for the past 20 plus years. This is my way of standing up against injustice and oppression and doing my sacred duty. There is a saying of Imam Ali, who is the great saint and successor to the Prophet Muhammad and the fourth Khalifa for the Muslims in general. He said, if someone is either your brother in faith or your equal in creation. So it's about treating all human beings with equality. My family, my parents migrated here to the United States. How many years is it now? I think it's almost 52 years ago. And my father worked primarily as a physician in the Lakewood community for about 47 years now. He's still, And one of the things he always said, and there was a large Jewish population there, and he said, I've always treated every single one of my patients as if they are my family members. And the respect that he gets from his patients shows just that he really cares. And he said, that's what my faith teaches me, to really treat every human being as if they are your relative, as if they're part of your family. Now, the question arises that what happens when we are in power and the people who are under our control, how are we supposed to treat them? So as Muslims, we go to the example of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his family. So during the first years of his mission, that he was commanded by God to go and spread the message of monotheism, to worship one God, to know that one God, to serve one God and to obey Him and to uphold peace and justice in the community. He invited people, his closest family members, to the faith, including an uncle. And this uncle refused his invitation, but he also persecuted him and treated him not very well. And he was put under sanctions by his own relatives and sent out for 3 years from his city, from his hometown, and basically left with no trade, no food, like basically under economic and political sanctions. Now, after that, after all this persecution, the Prophet Muhammad never used aggressive or unpeaceful means to promote his religion, even after the victory of his social movement, when Islam did become the superior power in the Arabian Peninsula. Now, the Almighty God says to him, he praises him and says, "So by mercy from God, O Muhammad, you were lenient with them, and if you had been severe and harsh-hearted, they would have turned away from you. So pardon them and ask forgiveness for them." His mercy and kindness were all-inclusive, and he would treat with forgiveness those who had been hostile against him for years, including the pagans of Mecca. On the day that the Mecca was conquered peacefully with no bloodshed, a companion of the Prophet said, "Today is the day of murder, war, and revenge." And the Prophet immediately rejected and rebuked the slogan, and he said, "No, today is a day of mercy. It is a day of mercy and kindness." Thus, the Prophet Muhammad would prevent any form of aggression, extremism against the opponents of Islam, and he relieved the polytheists of Quraysh by saying, "You are all free." We look at the example as Muslims from the Quran where the Prophet is shown and been called a mercy upon mankind. And it is something that we as Muslims are asked to do, to be merciful and kind to one another, to all human beings, to all of God's creation. In Islam, the Prophet, the way he would invite people to Islam, it could not be with coercion, with force. There's the verse in the Holy Quran that says, "La ikraha fi din." There's no compulsion in religion. You cannot force anyone to believe. He did not, even his greatest enemies at the time of his authority over them, he did not subdue them. And he said, if anyone wants to seek protection from you, please protect them freely and safely. And he showed us through the example in the best form of tolerance was the covenant of Medina. This was a covenant in the holy city of Medina where he was invited by the various tribes there. Many of them were Jewish tribes as well, and of other faiths, Christians as well. He taught them how to live together, to respect one another, to ensure harmony and stability in society, and the coexistence of Muslims, Jews, Christians, and polytheists. And he laid down a constitution detailing the responsibilities of all parties residing in Medina. It was also another story is at the time in Islamic history, during the time of Imam Ali's ruling, and he saw an old blind man who was begging on the streets. And he was shocked to witness this, wondering how could such things ever exist under an Islamic government. He asked about it and was told, this man is Christian. At that, Imam Ali said, when this man was powerful, you used his power. Now that he has been weak, you have left him alone. He felt that people leaving this person alone was against justice and compassion. And then he said, Imam Ali said, give to him from the public money for the Muslims. and allocate to him a welfare. So in the Islamic government, even a Christian or a Jew or any person who lived within had the right to having the social welfare. And they're being protected by the government. The Quran, which is the holy book, tells us that stand up firmly for justice as a witness to God, even as against yourselves or your parents or your kin, whether it be against rich or poor. Meaning justice is for all, and everyone should put justice first, even before their family. And it says in the Quran, in chapter 42, verses 42 to 43, act against those who oppress people and transgress against justice. They will have an agonizing punishment, though. If a person is patient and forgives, this is one of the greatest things. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, he said, O my servants, I have forbidden oppression for myself and have made it forbidden amongst you. So do not oppress one another. Do not put anyone under subjection or hardship, especially by the unjust force of authority. So this is just the basis of what Islam teaches us about taking care of the oppressed in our society, the minorities. And I know, just as the rabbi was speaking about incidents of anti-Semitism and the incidents of Islamophobia. The story the rabbi was saying about people making a circle, I think it was 2019, there was an attack on the Christ Church in New Zealand, and it was very heartwarming. 50 Muslims were killed, but just here in New Jersey, a group of people went to one of the mosques in New Jersey on Friday, and they made a circle of peace and protection around one of the mosques. And it was just, even though it's very painful and hard to see the loss of lives of worshipers, over 51, I think the number was, they were killed during worship services by an extremist right-wing person. And then there's countless, but the response of the community was very heartwarming. So, is there Islamophobia in the mainstream? Yes. There was a report, I think from July 26, 2022, that between the years 2017 to 2019, over $100 million was poured into 26 Islamophobia network groups to spread misinformation and conspiracy theories about Muslims and Islam. Unfortunately, Islamophobia is still an acceptable form of bigotry in America. So, contrary to public opinion people, what they might know, Islamophobic groups are not in the margins. They're fed millions of dollars to spread misinformation about Muslims and Islam. And they support anti-Muslim policies like the Muslim ban, using legal tools, lobbying special interest hate groups. And this money is used to purposely spread misinformation, to keep people from doing what we are doing today, coming together. And there's just a lot of information I could talk about, incidents that happened in school with Muslim students, attacks against mosques, threats against even little mosques in nice small little towns. People standing up. If there's a new mosque being built, there will be a lot of people out there saying, "Oh, we don't want a mosque in our, backyard," and just really post 9/11 as well, the incidents against Muslims, anti-Muslim incidents have increased and have become more and more mainstream. How is it being a Muslim in America? You hear about the travel bans, that you're not welcome. You also hear about when you travel and you come back, there is an institutionalized Islamophobia, so that if you have a Muslim name, you are going to be stopped and you're going to be asked questions about where you went, what you did. You can go check it on our Facebook, Instagram, it's all there, you know where we went. You don't need to subject me to humiliation as a Muslim, but that's the policy. But what do? We come together, we work together, try to understand one another. I know John was referring to our youth program, the Mosaic. We started doing Mosaic in 2013, but before that, we started off with something called Project Understanding back in probably 2008, 2009, around the same time when we started this, to get our youth to come together, to learn from one another. And one of the beautiful things about it is that when we do programs like Mosaic, where we bring our youth together, they not only learn about different faiths, they also learn about actual teachings of your own faith. So usually what happens is, you don't actually get a chance to hear from Monsignor Nir what the actual teachings are, or from the rabbi, or from me. You're hearing whatever is being fed through various sources out there. But when you actually are listening to the people who have the knowledge, and the students, the young people, are actually going and researching, and they're finding out, and they're able to present that to their peers. That's number one. Number two, they come together to do community service projects. So they're working together collaboratively. So we've done with Mosaic midnight runs with at Temple Shariamith, and taking food and clothing to the homeless in New York City. We've also done work with Family Promise. Our students have done work with Family Promise, working with the houses of worship that house people who are homeless, and many other community service projects. I think one of them was also working with new immigrants and actually teaching them English. The students were doing that during COVID, actually. And it was just fascinating to see how the students come up with these projects and how we can work together, to welcoming the newcomer, to working together, to welcoming and helping those who are less fortunate. And usually when we are living in, suburban communities, sometimes our students don't see that. And when they come to Mosaic and they come together and they see we have a common cause, and we have so much more in common to help the world, make the world a better place. And so there's hope. And we have to keep continuing and turn off your phone for a little bit and start talking to people. For real. Thank you.
Yes. Before we open up for questions, I just want to mention that it is so important we realize we all look at the world from our own space. And I can remember many Catholics saying, well, why don't we hear from the, quote, good Muslim leaders? We're always hearing on the media, especially, of death to America, the great Satan and everything. What about, And I remember sitting with a group of them and I said, folks, they don't have a pope. We as Catholics, we have a pope who, when he says something, not everybody believes him or will listen to him, but he has the right to speak. The leadership of so many branches of Islam gathered, I would say probably about 4 or 5 years ago, and I'm trying to remember, I think it was on an island in Crete. I think it might have been Crete or Cyprus. And they denounce the barbarism that is taking place by certain Islamic groups. It was never covered in the media. It was never covered in the media. I heard about it because there were Catholic observers there, and I heard it through the Catholic media that I read online. Okay, so there's a lot going on, but it's so important to realize that as Catholics, we have a hierarchy of understanding. Whether we'll follow it or not is completely different. But we know that the church has the right to speak, they will speak, and if you don't listen, you go to hell. But you still have the right not to listen. And that's one of the challenges, are those who don't listen. But not all religions or all peoples have that structure. And therefore, we have to understand that, that's an opening that allows me. And that really is an opening that came from this dialogue, So.
I talked a little bit about how much is spent on the Islamophobia industry. It makes money, If you look at Hollywood, I remember in my days at the university looking at 100 years of how, in Hollywood, how Muslims were presented, and there were never positive portrayals of it was all negative portrayals, like being barbaric, ignorant, backward, uncivilized. And it's almost like everything, all the cards are stacked against you. And then you're trying to say no, that's not what we stand for. That's not what our religion is. We made amazing, where did algebra come from? You can thank a Muslim for that.
You can keep algebra.
I know, but guess what? Thanks to algebra and al-Khwarizmi, we have algorithms, and algorithms up to computer science and our phones that we have today. So I said, we have to share it with you guys. Thank you very much. But anyway, so yeah, actually when my little one says, oh, why do I have to learn math? And I'm like, it's in our heritage. As Muslims, we study the difficult subjects and share it with everybody. Okay. So that the world can advance technologically. But anyway, so that's what I'm saying. There's always this thing. And why? Well, money is made from wars and fighting with people. So, yeah.
Makes good stories.
Yeah.
But sad results. Are there any questions? We're open for questions. Yes. To begin with, for the video. Oh, you're going to bring the mic? Okay. Thank you, Jen.
And don't worry, you won't be on camera.
Oh, is that?
No, they'll just hear your voice, but we're the ones on camera. Frank, do not move the cameras.
This is for Fatima? Fatima? Yes. What is the consensus or the attitude of the Muslim community or Muslim religion in regard to sanctity of life from womb to the tomb? Sanctity of life from the womb to the tomb for a Muslim?
Yes. So I will refer back to the Quran, and it says to save a life, one life, is as if you're saving all of mankind. And to take one life is as if you have killed all of mankind. So that's like the basis of our sanctity of life. Like every single life is valuable. And from the womb, so preserving life is very, very important. But for abortion is not allowed, but contraception is, and taking precautions not to get pregnant is, and helping people if they had unintended pregnancies, like providing that social support.
Any other questions, please? Over there, Jen.
Oh.
Before Jen leaves, we're going to make her work.
Yep.
It's another question, but we're talking about abortion. And having been born in 1934 in Germany, outside of Cologne, lived through the war, and certainly know the rule of Hitler and the Nazis. Now, Hitler was the grandfather of abortion. If a child had any kind of handicap, not even a real handicap, just wasn't perfect, they had to be aborted. That's how it started. We all know what came afterwards. Not only the unborn with handicaps, but any child that wasn't perfect had to be annihilated. Okay? And from there on, it kept on, of babies being used for experimental purpose and all kinds of stuff. That is the danger that starts with abortion. It doesn't stay there. It's not just a terrible thing of aborting children, but it gets further, and it becomes a country without soul.
If I could just add to that, just for a moment. It's interesting that you brought up the program of doing away with children that were not perfect, who were mental deficiencies, or today we'd say special needs. That was the one program that religious leaders spoke against, especially the Catholic Church, but also the Evangelical Church, and the Nazis stopped it. And it showed that when the churches spoke as a body, at that point, the government had to listen. And so, the issue, and I don't want to get into the issue of abortion. This is not the topic for it. It is important to realize, though, that when religious institutions come together to speak in the defense of human life and dignity across the boards, womb to tomb, the world listens. Just when the Holy Father, Pope Francis, went to Dubai and signed that document of human fraternity, that made all the news, okay, and was the subject of several other trips that he's made. So, but you're right, human life, if it's not respected. But I do not want to get into a discussion on abortion at this point, because that's not the topic. But thank you.
I do feel like I need to. Did you want to finish, sir?
I have one other thing.
Yeah.
In defense of Pope Pius XII, there have been so many things said about he didn't do anything to the Jewish people, he didn't do anything for the Jewish, or very little, further from the truth. Pope Pius XII has secretly taken Jews into the Vatican and smuggled them into Switzerland. Unfortunately, Switzerland handed a lot of them back to the Nazis. Okay?
I didn't even know that. I knew Pius XII did,
that's the truth.
a lot of defenses.
Yeah, and one has to understand the mentality of Hitler.
Can the rabbi respond?
Pardon me?
I'm sorry.
One has to understand the mentality of Hitler. He wouldn't have waited 2 seconds to take over the Vatican and put every cardinal and the Pope into jail. If he would have openly offended Hitler, one has to understand that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You were going to say something.
Yes, I just, just to be clear about the Jewish stance on womb to tomb, we share the same concept as the same teaching is found in the Talmud of if you save a life, you've saved the world. If you destroy a life, you've destroyed a world. There is the challenge of what happens when a woman's life is endangered because of her pregnancy. I see you rolling your eyes, but as someone who actually almost died, it is a reality, and there is room in Judaism for an abortion to take place. Now we are sitting together as children of God. We have different beliefs. We see things in different ways. And there are challenges here that get answered in different ways. I respect your understanding of it. I respect yours, and I can understand it. And what I'm asking you to do is to also respect that there's another way of looking at this, and that I can also value life and see its sanctity of life and protect life, while holding a different opinion and view.
Jen.
Yeah, thank you for that, Melinda. And also, just to clarify the Catholic perspective on that, if a woman's life is in danger, procedures can be done to save her life, that if they have the accidental result of abortion, even if it's known that that's going to be, that the child's life is going to end as a result of that life-saving technique. It's not the purpose of, the technique, but it does save the woman's life. It is still allowed. We don't have abortions, but if a woman is in danger and she has to have a life-saving procedure and the baby dies as a result of it, that is acceptable in the Catholic Church. Okay? All right, does anybody have any other questions?
I just wanted to remind you that we'll be meeting again at 7 o'clock on March 15th, which is my mother's birthday, so please bring gifts and cake. And we'll be talking about gratitude, an easier topic. And we'll be meeting at the Islamic Center. I just do remind you, you may want to wear socks because we ask people to remove their shoes in respect to the sacred community, and also women to bring a headscarf to cover your hair. A hat is fine too. So we hope to see you then. Thank you all for coming out tonight. And
Rabbi, I just had one closing thought I wanted to share with folks, if that's okay. About hard conversations and how we can have them respectfully, which was a big portion of the rabbi's talk. I was speaking to a friend today who began crying and said, I'm sorry, I know tears are a sign of weakness. Before I became a pastor, I was a hospital chaplain. And one of the first things they teach you as a hospital chaplain, as someone who can be present in the darkest parts of what it means to be human, in the face of horrifying death, addiction, terminal diagnoses, all of the hard parts of humanity, is that you can't be afraid of tears. You can't be afraid of discomfort, because that puts a wall between you and your patient. People who tell you that tears are a sign of weakness admit that your tears make them uncomfortable. The purpose of dialogues such like this are to be a little uncomfortable so that we can learn from one another what it means to live in another body, to think with a different set of social expectations, but also to connect about what it means for the human heart to beat. So this is the last one of these I get to do. This is the last one of these that Jen gets to do. We're going to be taking the lessons of this interfaith group to our new community in Massachusetts, and hopefully we'll be able to forge similar relationships and find another place for dialogue like this. So if there's one final piece that of advice that I can give, it's get a little uncomfortable. Tears are messy, but they're human. But if you can sit in that discomfort with someone, you can learn more about what it means to live and think and feel as they do.
Thank you for coming, and please watch your step as you go out to your cars.